Hello, LinkedIn. We're back. Hello. It's been a while since I've done a LinkedIn Live, and today I am thrilled to have Chris Kim from Airtable joining us, head of social for Airtable. But I've known Chris for quite a while. I'll let you introduce yourself, Chris, if you want to, and how we got to know each other. Hi,
Yep.
Ryan. Hi, Diane. Looking at the comments.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sarah. Great to see you. So Sarah and I go back quite a bit back to the SAP days. So I've been doing social for the past several years, since probably before it was called social, back when it was blogs and discussion forums, and before Twitter and Facebook and all the rest. But Sarah and I have worked together. I've been mostly in the B2B enterprise space for the past several years. So places like SAP, Workday, ServiceNow, Hitachi. And so she and I have connected probably at 3 or 4 of the different places I've been at. We always run into each other. And so very honored to be on this LinkedIn Live. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Most memorable, I think we were just talking about before we went live, was a lovely French vineyard, wasn't it, Chris?
Yes,
That was great fun. Somewhere in France with Hitachi. It was great. Right, now I'm going to just do this up front because Chris was a bit inspired and he had an idea before we came. He watched some of our summer episodes and he thought, well, Halloween's on its way. So he said, I challenge you to come up with a costume. And I have to say, so here's mine, right? And you've got to guess in the comments just before we get started. There you go. Does it give it away? I think you know. If anybody knows, there's a delay on the comments, Chris, so they won't come up straight away. But this is mine, so we can guess who we are.
All right.
I was shouting at my kids to get me the scarf, but anybody want to? Harry Potter, if you hadn't guessed. So there you
go. All right.
Yeah, I should have drawn to. Go for it, Chris.
All right. So here's my little reveal. This will take a second.
Right. Go on. Anyone? And again, there's a delay.
Okay. Yeah. This is the. I can't actually wear it. One, because it would bother me while talking, and also because this is like a one-time use mustache. But let's get this one.
Yeah, we'll have to see answers in the comments if anyone's watching, because they get it like 2 minutes later. But there you go. I think. Do you know? I think that's great luck, Chris. I think you should keep that.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I wish I could grow a mustache. My kids are not quite old enough to watch this show, so they're like, "Who is this person that you're dressed up as?"
Yeah, go and tell our audience then, Chris.
Ted Lasso.
Ted
Do you
Lasso.
have any Ted Lasso fans out there?
Got the whistle and everything. I love it. Right, let's get down to some serious stuff. So, I tell you what, though, Chris, and this is where I've got a load of questions, but honestly, I just think sometimes I go off track. What gets me is all those companies that you've said you work for, you know, ServiceNow, Workday, where you're now, Airtable. You have got a lot of experience leading social in these IT companies, in IT organizations, and you've done social selling. And what caught my eye, which is why I reached out to you, was your opinions around employee generated content. I think you co-wrote an article, you were interviewed for someone earlier this year, and that for me is a hot topic. So I want to explore all of this. I'm going to start first, though, with what have you seen moving from company to company, and how social has evolved over the years, but also how you see other organizations manage it differently.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So in some ways, there are some things that have not changed as far as just the core value prop of employee advocacy, introducing it, getting it sold, and getting buy-in, change management. A lot of that stuff is very similar. What I think I've seen evolve more is, one more just of a focus on it, whether people realize they're talking about employee advocacy or not. Like whenever I join a new company, one of the first things that leadership or colleagues talk about is like, well, how do we get our employees or our executives more engaged, right? I see that more and more over the years, right? And I think that's really good, because I think, if you go maybe 5-6 years ago, a lot of the employee advocacy tools are really just around amplification, right? Like let's just get the word out as many people as we can. And there's still value in that, obviously, but I'm seeing more in a good way, a more kind of sophisticated approach or a more inquisitive nature of like, how do we actually do this properly and in a way that actually drives business results? And so that's kind of one thing is I'm able to start at a higher sort of baseline, I think,
Oh yeah.
have a more strategic discussion versus like, oh, we just need a tool in place to amplify.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing that I've noticed, especially more recently in the last year or two, is just the notion of what content and user-generated content is also evolving. And I think that's really positive because kind of going back to what I was saying before, a lot of when you think of content, a lot of people just thought of like, all right, whatever you put into the tool, that's what you're sharing. But I've really started to expand kind of my way of viewing content. It's not just sort of the formal things that you share, but it's also, the comments that you make on people's posts, or the new formats that have evolved, like little self-done videos, and obviously things like LinkedIn articles and blogging and things like that, or just sort of like long form LinkedIn posts, right, which are pseudo blogs. So I've come to really think about content in a broader sense. Like the employee advocacy, the tools are still very important, obviously, but I always, I've been doing like lunch and learns recently at Airtable, and I often pull examples from employees who are sharing their own form of user-generated content. And so that's really exciting because that's obviously more authentic. So I think just the definition of how we think about content from users has expanded, and I think in a positive way.
Oh, do you know, I love this. Right, we're going to dig into this. Right, I've got to just do some hellos. Evan, hi Evan, and Di, and Anita, hello. And who else we got? Bill's on. Sandy, Adam, Chris, Kim.
Sandy,
So
my friend, yes.
Yes, you'll know. Now, if you see me moving, it's because the light keeps going off, and if I don't move, the light will switch. We will be in darkness. So there you go. Social selling. Where does that sit, Chris? Because you've talked about social, how we get employees and leaders on there.
Yeah.
What about social selling and sales teams?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that is part of the broader holistic kind of advocacy model, if you will. But obviously social selling is geared towards that customer facing, whether it's a salesperson or a CSM, a XDR, and that's its own kind of discipline, if you will. And that is true. To me, that requires true partnership with sales and sales enablement.
Yes.
And so whenever I, started a new company or I'm working with new colleagues, I always try to identify, okay, well, what's the sales organization? How is it structured? But then also like, what does their enablement function look like? And I always try to build that partnership right from the beginning, because you don't want to do things kind of on your own and rogue. You want to be able to slot into existing programs or platforms that they're using, right? That's really, I think, I found the best way to partner with sales is to really integrate with their existing programs, right?
Yeah,
So
perfect. And so I'm going to ask you the first question that actually Ryan did put together, and it does relate. So it's about content creation and social selling.
Yeah.
I've heard in the past from some customers, I don't want my salespeople creating content. They haven't got time for that. Time doing that is time not selling. So where's your view? Where do salespeople start with content creation? Where does it end?
Yeah. So like the approach I usually try to take is, because anticipating those kinds of reactions is really, you don't want to do social, and I get it. Like you don't want to do social just to do social, right? It needs to ladder up to a broader objective. It needs to help them get their job done. It needs to achieve their objective. So, one of the things from a sales perspective is, they always talk about, you want to be known as that trusted voice, that trusted advisor, right? That's a very common term. And to me, content is a core way to do that. That's how you build your personal brand. And that's how you become that trusted advisor, through sharing content, industry articles, your own thoughts, and sharing that with your network. And to me, those things go hand in hand. So again, laddering up to a higher objective, that is, to me, the way I tend to kind of approach social selling, whether it's employee advocacy or a sales navigator or whatever it is. I approach it, through the lens of like, how did I make this salesperson, this XDR, this rep successful? And then I also kind of, again, thinking holistically, I frame it in a framework, because like it's very easy for the tool to be seen as the program.
Yes.
Here's the tool. This is our advocacy program. When that's actually not the case, right? The tool is important, but it is a lever to achieve the broader strategic objective.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of that kind of thing that needs to constantly be in your mind as a social media leader, is to how do you frame this and to really get to that strategic framing right away. And that's just a constant like internal marketing motion you need to have.
I think that's such a good point that you made there. This has come up on these LinkedIn Lives before, that people treat the tool as the program.
Yeah.
It is not. It's an enabler. It's a step. But it's interesting, actually, because I'd like to ask you about the evolution of this then, because we've gone from this place where we have the tool in, and that accelerates amplification of content that's put into the tool. Some encourage employees to contribute content to that tool. Others are very locked down, especially in regulated industries. Sometimes they don't want anyone putting stuff in that tool unless it's the admin. So there's different attitudes to that. But now we've got this evolution of content, employee generated content, user generated content. So how does that work then? How does that fit with the advocacy tool and the amplification? How do you facilitate that?
Yeah. So again, that does ladder up to the larger framework. So again, the tool is the enabler. But what I've learned, again, like in the last year or two, is that not necessarily everything fits into the tool. Like the tool is still critical, but a lot of content, again, as my broader view of content, is not something that like you can put into a tool and everyone can amplify. But that again speaks to the broader idea of being a trusted advisor. There's this phrase that I stole many years ago. I can't remember who it's from, but whenever I'm doing like a social selling training, I always say, be known for what you know, not what you sell. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the mantra. And so to achieve that, that can be in the form of sharing content from a tool, industry articles, whatever, even, product information, things like that. But a lot of it is just like making a comment on somebody's post or being helpful. I mean, that is the main thing, is like, you have to have that sense of you want to help people. And that is, one is obviously more authentic. It leads to kind of your passion and your expertise. But then what you find is that if you're commenting on posts and just being helpful, without even talking about your brand, that's how you build that trusted advisor status. So they sort of go hand in hand a little bit, but not everything necessarily has to go in the tool, right?
No,
so kind of look at
I think that's a great observation, actually, and I think it's one that as organizations we need to recognize that, because sometimes you can recognize the people that are ready for content generation. I mean, like video content, because I have been in situations where I think social teams, they really want to accelerate their employees to create blogs and create videos, but it's so far away from where their comfort zone is. So identifying the triggers that maybe an employee is ready for that. So here's my next question. How do you get, is there a maturity journey that you recognize at Airtable? Do you see the employees that are ready to be pushed to the video, pushed to the blog? Do you recognize the ones that are not yet ready? How do you, or do you treat everyone the same? And do you say, right, here's the training for commenting?
Great question. So I think the way I think about it is, as a first step, I think I always try to put in sort of a company-wide employee advocacy guidelines, a tool or whatever, because that sets the tone. Because, as we all know, a lot of companies, depending on what culture you're entering in, some people, they may have a culture of not sharing. Employees are afraid to say the right thing. So I think it's important to set a company-wide tone that like, hey, social sharing and being an ambassador and an advocate is a good thing, and we encourage that. And so even before we layer on social selling or whatever, always kind of having a baseline to set that culture, and that's through new hire onboarding, that's through other means. And then once you sort of have that established and you continue to nurture that at a company-wide level, then you follow up with the social selling and layered on aspects of it. So I can't remember if I answered that question, but
how you identify whether employees are ready to start blogging or do video. Or, you don't want to push people people too fast, because you've just said there, you know, some people are going to be coming in like, oh, not sure about this.
Yeah. So there's sort of a baseline setting, and then there's kind of a process where you sort of identify your hand raisers, right?
Oh yeah.
I think most companies, I mean, when I joined Airtable, there was only 500 people, but even then, you could quickly kind of do a scan, and you can see who's already out there. There's some people who might be generating content, like who are people who are ready, and they tend to be a lot of people in customer-facing roles like sales or marketing or recruiting.
Okay.
So you try to identify them. They can sort of be your aspirational, rock stars, but then you also don't want to force people, but you want to give people opportunity and a path to build up to. So like whenever I do a social selling training, I have a framework. It's somewhat of a virtuous cycle, but I'm like, first thing, obviously you optimize your LinkedIn profile. Then it's about connecting, always be connecting. Then listening, just listening, seeing what the conversations are like. Then the next step would be engaging or sharing. And then the next step is engaging. And then like the stretch goal is you're actually being a creator. So I view that. I don't say like everyone has to be a creator. Everyone needs to be blogging or creating videos, but I do kind of point to that as kind of an aspirational goal. And then I give examples, right? Here's somebody who's doing it well. You can do it long form, you can do it short form, but just to kind of see the art, like what's possible, and presenting that. And then of course, reinforcing that, because it's not just about like the one training session you do or the one lunch and learn that you do. You always have to continue to reinforce it in different ways, but in organic kind of ways, right? So
yeah, because I mean, people reach different levels of maturity at different times. You've got to build a. Some people leave. You need to replace those, don't you? I've got some comments in here. So people like the tool, not the program. That's a great point. Be known for what you know, not for what you sell. Crawl, walk, run, or like, comment, post. Love that, Jacob. Crawl, walk, run, like, comment, post. Be known for what you do. Hi, Mihaela. Nice to have you here. Donna Spencer as well. Yeah, I just crawled. Love this. I think that's a really cool point. There's a few things that you mentioned on there actually about onboarding. And also using your ambassadors, and you call them advocates and ambassadors, and shining a light on them as aspirational. Not everyone's got to get here, but this is what good looks like. But it is. How do you convince people, or do you slowly nurture them? Because just this week or last week, someone at Apple got fired for creating an amazing TikTok video about them. Yeah. And, they didn't do it with malice, right? They did it because they were proud. And then some employees might be looking at that thinking, I don't want to get into trouble. Do I have to go through brand compliance and What's your view on how you support employees through that anxiety?
Right. So first of all, Apple is always like a separate entity unto itself. Right? They're probably not the best in class necessarily, I would say, as far as employee enablement. Let's just say that. Amazing company, obviously. But as far as that, like, again, I think it is a continuous kind of education and encouragement, and also showing people what's possible. You want to have your guidelines, obviously, in your social media policy, and have those, articulated in various ways. But I also feel like, there is, I tend to lean towards the, trusting your employees, right, to share. And I usually start with that. And again, if you've created a culture where people are encouraged, but then you're also, giving them tips and best practices, but then also, guardrails, to do's, what not to do's, that kind of thing. So if you sort of build that as a, kind of a trusted guide within the company, then I think they're more likely to take on any guidelines that you have. But yeah, it's it's a constant, just an ongoing thing. Like you never want to obviously censor what people are saying, unless for obvious things like proprietary information, things like that. And also, we never, we never want people to feel or do that like we're monitoring them, right? We all have social listening tools, but I'm not like, I don't have keywords to see what people are saying. Like, if people are mentioning us, I might see it, but we're not being Big Brother and following all of our employees and seeing what they're saying. So I think it's a constant reinforcement of encouragement, but then also just being trustworthy and just being smart, right? And then encouraging questions. If people have gray area, questions, they should feel comfortable, raising them to me or my team.
So here's a question that you kind of brought up earlier that I'm quite interested about getting buy-in and convincing. Yeah. So, because you're coming at it from a trust perspective, which I cannot agree with more. This is how it needs to be. What about senior leaders? And you've worked in enough organizations, so I'm not asking specifically at Airtable, but actually from all the other roles that you've had to do. How do you convince them? Because I'm going to throw a scenario at you. I've heard through someone that they say, our leaders, they don't want us to invest, then get our employees on social. So they raise their brand and profile. So they become bigger than the brand.
That one is, I would say that particular viewpoint would be a somewhat narrow viewpoint. I think if they're expressing the brand and representing your brand well, that's all positive, and there's also an understanding that these are they're expressing their views, but I would just look at examples. Like whenever I kind of interact with leadership, I have data and I have a strategy involved, but I always back it up with specific examples, because I found that a lot of times, like if you're presenting to a leadership team and or executive, like those anecdotes and those specific examples, those are the things that they remember.
Yeah.
And so I will give an example of somebody who is, really a great ambassador for the company, and how whatever the results they've achieved, whether it's a large footprint or how they're being able to get meetings that they wouldn't normally be able to, or they're just building relationships with the customer base. So really kind of pinpointing really good examples. I found that is a really can be a powerful way in terms of kind of shifting their mindset. Just give them examples of like how this is working, and then backing it up with the larger data around like what earned media value. It depends on who you're talking to as well. So if you're talking to a marketing leader, I talk about earned media value, or increase in reach or engagement. If I'm talking to a salesperson, a sales leader, I might throw some sales navigator stats out there. I can talk about attribution. If I'm talking to a CEO, I might talk about crisis comms or something like that, right? So you kind of have to think about your audience, just like all good marketers do, and think about what's going to resonate with them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, about how you demonstrate the ROI. So I think that's really fascinating actually, that you're looking at different audience, what's going to open their eyes, and then say, okay, I'm going to talk to you in a language that you understand, and spin the conversation. I think it's very interesting around social selling, because I know specifically we wanted to talk about that within the IT industry. Would you say there are any sort of specific challenges in the IT industry that you see when it comes to content creation? Do you?
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. And as I think about it, I think there are. I think because anyone who works in technology, if you're selling to a business, there's a couple things. So a lot of times if you're working for, if you're selling a software or hardware or whatever services, you're trying to reach a decision maker, and that can be a lot of times in the IT department. So you're trying to convince like a CIO, that level. So that messaging might be more about ROI and business impact, but a lot of times you're also speaking to maybe somebody below the line, like an individual user, in which case they may not care so much about dollars saved and budget and things like that, but they're really thinking about productivity and how it's able to have make my job easier or achieve my objective. So again, it's like thinking about your specific audience. But in IT, because a lot of times you're selling to multiple departments within a company, multiple levels, you really have to think about what that audience is and what's going to resonate with them. And then as far as your personal network, you have to kind of understand what your personal network is, like who that audience is as well. And then there's another layer, I guess, for example, with Airtable, we're a PLG, a product-led, growth company, which basically means that we achieved a lot of our, early adoption through self-serve users, people getting on the trial, using the free trial. And a lot of times it's more of a bottom-up adoption.
Right.
The like classic examples like Slack or Dropbox, companies like that, where it was like, it didn't start from the top. It started with a groundswell of teams and departments using it. And then there became a tipping point where you started to get enterprise-wide things. So in those cases, like, you're trying to convince people to like get on the trial, or here's a feature that's going to really change the game for you. That's a totally different conversation than company level ROI and business value. So you have to understand kind of what your audience is, or may have to toggle between both. But that's kind of the art and science of marketing, right? So
yeah, I know. And I'm thinking here from a sales perspective, as a social seller, the buying circles are getting bigger.
Yeah.
There's more people in them. There are some above the line, some below the line. They've got different motivations. There's a lot more in the buying, different content for different audiences.
Yeah.
Wow, that's complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how you do that digitally.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking of the content mix of a salesperson,
right.
and when you're building your content strategy as an account executive, how do you make sure that you hit, as many of those triggers as possible?
Right.
How does your advocacy tool have all that content? How can you ensure your sales teams are equipped with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think like a tool where you're curating content, like I have them all, you have them into different categories and things like that. But there is a level of the employee needing to understand that audience and who you're trying to reach. And so, there's your social media, your social networks, which kind of could cut across multiple departments or companies. But then you might have your individual prospect or customer relationships, and you might be using Sales Navigator or something to reach out to them. And then you might be able to target a little more because this specific account is very interested in such and such topic, or this value prop. But it is a challenge, especially if you're thinking about like, well, what do I share on my LinkedIn network, which could be cut across multiple audiences. In which case I think it is a bit of testing, and you have to have a little bit of an editorial mindset to it. So looking at your metrics and looking at your data. So I try to incorporate that into my training as well, as like, how do I as an employee look at my metrics so I can understand what's working well, what's not. Because we each are, our own little mini brands and our own mini publishing houses. So that's kind of a takeaway, is like, to make sure you have that training so people can understand how do they interpret their own metrics, so they can they can understand what's performing well, what's not,
and where to make the right decisions.
Yeah.
So coming back to the content, I love that about the storytelling, editor skills, narrative, publishing house. You are helping employees create their own professional brand in a way, and go as far along that content generation journey as they want to. How have you seen in your career working with all these different brands, how does marketing have a role to play in this? Do you see marketing sort of siphoning off a bit of their content budget and go, do you know what, actually employee generated content is quite valuable, should we maybe invest in that as well? How, or employees expected to do all of it off their own back?
Another great question. So like, at a previous company I'd worked at, I was working in comms, but I had partnered with marketing to share the budget of the advocacy program, because for that reason, at least in that scenario, I was able to measure things like, employee shares of gated content generated X times more form fills, than standard, right? Like you can put some metrics together to really show. And that was actually not necessarily something that I expected, but it was an awesome surprise. I'm like, wow, employees are sharing some of this gated content and people are completing it, and they're qualified leads, right? And so I was able to make that case to marketing to say, hey, this is actually can be part of your go-to-market. This can actually feed your pipeline. And that's a language they speak, right? So
Yeah.
another just general guideline is like, obviously tell your story with data as much as you can, right? And if you have that mindset, it will also lead to things where it's like, oh, I'm not tracking that, maybe I should be, and then it will force some discussions with your marketing ops people and things like that. Like I always go through that process of, oh, I want to be able to tell this story, I want to be able to measure this. Can I do that in our current martech stack? And if not, I can have a discussion with our ops team and think about like what makes sense. And then you build out partnerships. So as they start to build their strategy for next year, the whole marketing strategy, you can feed into that and even influence that potentially.
Yeah, I'm really feeling that you are like the facilitator. You said it about sales as well. You fit
Yeah.
into their processes, you fit
Right.
into their programs. In your comms role previously, you fitted into the marketing way of doing
Yeah.
things and you sold it to them. So you're kind of like the facilitator really
Yeah.
internally of bringing this together, which is something we talk a lot about at Tribal actually, is about connecting the dots, because
Yeah.
someone needs to connect the social dots. Otherwise, you're going to
Yeah.
have stuff going off in all directions. And
Right. And as social leaders, we're kind of in one of the best positions because we work with everybody. We're one of the few roles that really works with every customer facing and even internal facing department within a company. So we have that full holistic view and can connect those dots. And we can also speak their language, right? That's another thing, is like you can speak a language of sales if you're talking to a salesperson, or HR if you're talking about recruiting impact, or marketing, right? So it's fun. It's part of what makes our jobs fun.
it does. Oh, I've got so many questions. I know. I can't believe we're already at half an hour in. I know that Philip Ryan's going to be wanting to wrap this up. Look, I'm going to ask that one in a minute. I am going to get my other ones through. So, what advice would you give to folks that are trying to encourage their employees to create content? And they can't get, especially in technical IT space, it's very difficult to get technical audiences to get out there. They don't, in my experience, they don't typically want to be celebrities, popular.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're very happy keeping their knowledge
Mm-hmm.
here and working with customers. How do you
Right.
break down that barrier?
Yeah, it's again kind of showing them what's possible and what can help them achieve their objectives, and that can be a little different depending on the role and their individual perspectives. So again, and also doing a little bit of myth busting. Like I think people think content, they think, oh my God, a big blog post, a 10-minute video, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. But again, like as I've learned, like the really short form pieces, like just even a comment on a post, if it's something that you're passionate about and you have experience in, those things can be just as impactful. Like I've been learning, this is on more of a social media side, but I see on my LinkedIn feed, people are engaging with different conversations, and there may be people that I'm not even connected to, but it's a cool conversation. And I might throw in a little comment there just to add to it because it's something, oh, that's cool. And this is what I feel. And those like little 2-sentence comments, they will get engaged. Then people start to connect with me and you start to build, your network that way. So I try to give a lot of examples to folks to give them an idea that it's not necessarily always a huge lift. And then the other big thing is, I've learned, and I always have to remind myself, is like salespeople, employees, they learn best when they teach each other, right? It's one thing if we say it. And so I always try to find a space for employees to share successes and best practices with each other. And what's great is now we're kind of like in a total Slack world. And so like the Airtable, for example, we have a channel where like salespeople and CSMs, where they can share just success stories. It's not just social media, but it's like, oh, here's how I framed an in-mail that got me a meeting, right? And so we just share stuff with each other. And because it's kind of an always on channel, it's kind of nice. We can just drop in little ideas. And that's great. That's a change from maybe 2-3 years ago, where it was like, I felt like I had to do all the training. And then I'd always build in like 10 minutes in the end of my training to just be like free for all. Does anybody want to share a success story they've had, a salesperson? And so those are still great. And I still make sure to do that. But now that a lot of us use Slack or Teams or whatever, you can have more of an always on sharing capability. And so that's a big one, I think, is again, showing people what's possible, but having them teach each other.
Yeah. Again, the facilitator role. Love it.
Yeah,
Oh,
totally. Yeah.
and it's interesting. I was talking to someone this morning about this, doing a coaching session with the CFO, and saying about the algorithm. It does favor. I literally went down my news feed and said, "Look at this one. This post is in my news feed because someone in my network commented on it."
Yeah.
And just the other week, I commented on something. I wasn't connected to them at all, but it was about childcare costs, and that now I'm connected to them, and we're having an offline conversation. And you just, I told you the light would fall off. Look, I knew that would happen. But yeah, I just think that's such good advice. Right. The other thing I wanted to ask, you are quite visionary, actually, Chris. I know this was not on the questions, but you have done this in a few high-profile companies now. So you've seen the trend, you've seen the questions, the objections, the what works, what doesn't. Where do you see this going? Where do you see social going in the future for companies?
As far as like advocacy and
Yeah, all of it actually. The whole social, because a lot of brands are still in the let's publish on our brand and let's use employee advocacy tools to get content out. But where do you see all this the future? I'm putting you on the spot here, but
Wow.
how do you think it all
Yeah.
changing?
I mean, I think where my mind goes is that, it's more of a general trend that we're all creators, right? And so I do think that as those opportunities, if you think about like who was a creator, 3-4 years ago, it's a much broader group now. Part of that is sort of this TikTok generation, but I think there's also just more of the platforms have evolved. LinkedIn 6 years ago was basically just like for job hunting and resume. Now it's especially in B2B, it's where people go to find and consume content, right? Yeah. So I think we will continue to see more people creating their own content, which is great. There will be less of a how do I say it? Less of a focus on sort of this super polished content, right, that we see from brands. And there's certainly a place for all of that. But if you think about what's the content that resonates and performs the best, like you're saying, it's like a lot of times it's an employee, like I snapped a photo of a team meeting we had last week just for fun. And I was looking at my metrics, I'm like, man, that did better than like some of our brand posts, and it's, just like a little, it's so that whole idea of non-polished, just authentic content, I think that will just continue. I think the platforms themselves seem to be trending that way again, right? Like Facebook years ago, now we're starting to see LinkedIn. When I look at our Instagram posts, the top performing posts are never the polished, like here's our TV ad. It's always the user generated. I shot this with my iPhone. Like by a mile, right? So I think the trend towards more user-generated, just authentic content will continue, and I think that's really good. And then there's a whole analytics piece. I think that will continue to, like, how do we measure this stuff? I'm starting to see more tools out there that's getting a little more beyond the vanity metrics and things like that, and starting to close the gap as far as attribution. So that's exciting to see. So I think it will just be more of the same of what we're seeing in terms of trends, and that's happening every day, right? Every week we see new things changing. So
absolutely. In fact, just this week, Julia in our team notified us that videos will have auto captioning on LinkedIn.
Yes,
it's rolling out, which is great because it just makes it more accessible and inclusive. And a lot of people faff about trying to get SRT files aligned to videos.
Totally.
So brilliant. They're evolving to become content generation. So I love it. I love it. Right. If there's one thing you want to leave our audience as a takeaway, Chris, what would you say? What would you?
Let's see. I thought about this one, and my first thought was one that's been shared on other LinkedIn lives that you've had, which is just think about it's about the long game and relationship building, right?
Yeah.
But then I was like, oh, everybody knows that on this call. They know that. So then I started thinking about what I shared earlier, which is just remind yourself to create opportunities for employees and salespeople to share with one another. Because again, that's when it sticks, and that's when they really understand the value, is when a rep can say, oh yeah, I did this at my last company. And especially like in tech, it's funny, like at Airtable, we have a lot of people who actually used to work at like LinkedIn and Twitter. So being in Silicon Valley. So it's like, I think you guys probably have some good stories that you can share. People actually like sold Sales Navigator. So I'm like, I think you probably have some good social selling tips.
Yeah, come on, guys. The thing that I take away actually is when you said about, you really are the facilitator of a lot of this. And I think social leaders will evolve their role to become that, expert at understanding the language of the different stakeholders in the company. That comes across loud and clear for me, Chris, as something that you've pretty much mastered throughout your career. And you go straight in with selling the proposition at a strategic level and the value of that. And then you work it through, working with each of the functions. I just think that's brilliant.
Yeah. And I think companies in general, like leadership, they're getting more, at least having a curiosity and understanding of the value of social, right? Like I feel like I have more of a seat at the table right off the bat compared to, several years ago. And that's good, right? So, but then you want to continue to build on that. And it's, you're right. It is about that facilitator relationship, building all these relationships, understanding like how to speak their language, what does success mean to them, and then that builds that trust, right? So, and then that gives you more resources, and et cetera, et cetera.
And data. Chris, thank you so much for coming today and speaking to us about this. And I know we've got people listening and commenting, and if there's any questions or if you want to connect with Chris, where do we find you? I guess that you're going to be on LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best, just connect with me there.
Yeah, fabulous. And I want to thank you for bringing all that and sharing that with us. How to engage, how to sell it, how to bring it in. Great tips. So thank you very much, Chris, for being part of this and agreeing to share your experiences. So
thank you. Right. Yeah, no, again, honored to be on this, and hopefully it was helpful to folks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Jacob and Donna. See you later. See you next time.